Picture a heat wave. It's 100 degrees outside and not the dry kind. This is wet heat, the sort that sits on your skin like a damp towel and refuses to move. Now picture the power going out. In a modern apartment, sealed behind double glazed glass and a foot of insulation, you have maybe 3 hours before the inside catches up to the outside and keeps climbing. By nightfall, it's an oven, and you can't open it because the windows were never really built to open. 700 years ago, in the merchant streets of Kyoto, people lived through summers just as brutal in houses you could almost see straight through. Wood, paper, and woven straw. No glass, no machine humming in the wall. But those houses stayed cool. So how did a house made of paper beat the sealed, climate-controlled box you pay to live in today? It was the 1330s, and in a small cottage outside Kyoto, a Buddhist monk named Kenko was writing down whatever crossed his mind. Japan was deep in its medieval age, the long stretch from the Kamakura era into the Muromachi, when samurai ruled and the old court drifted toward memory. The notes Kenko jotted survived all of it. We call the collection Tsurezuregusa, Essays in Idleness, and it sits today among the cornerstones of medieval Japanese literature. Buried in it is one short line about building a house that Japanese carpenters would treat as law for the next 500 years. Kenko's advice was blunt. Build your house for the summer. In winter, he wrote, you can manage almost anywhere, but a house that fails you in the heat is unbearable to live in. Sit with how strange that priority is. A builder in Northern Europe optimized against one enemy, the cold, and that single goal explains nearly everything he did. The thick walls, the small windows, the sealed box built to hoard a fire's warmth. Japan flipped it. The killer in central Japan was never really winter. It was August. Heat in the high 90s, paired with humidity thick enough to turn still air into a swamp and breed mold on a wall in a matter of days. So while European builders spent centuries learning to trap heat and seal it in, Japanese builders spent those same centuries mastering the opposite craft. How to let a building breathe. How to push heat out faster than the summer sun could pour it in. They were not behind. They were solving a different equation, and they solved it with wood, paper, straw, and a precise reading of physics. And this was no peasant improvisation. The same open post and beam screen-divided plan ran straight through the period, from the sprawling residences of the Heian court to the Shoin studies of the Muromachi warlords and the tea masters who refined them into an art. Rich or poor, city or country, the Japanese house was built around the same idea. A light timber skeleton wrapped in surfaces you could open, close, or carry away. And the version of this story you've heard, that the old houses were just charming, primitive, drafty things, isn't the full picture. What follows is closer to engineering than nostalgia. Let me walk you through the machine, piece by piece, because no single part of it is the trick. It's a system where every component hands its work to the next. Start at the top, with the roof. The first thing you notice about an old Japanese house is the eaves, the way the roofline reaches out far past the wall below it, sometimes 3 or 4 feet, like the wide brim of a hat. That overhang is not decoration. It's a sundial doing arithmetic. At Kyoto's latitude, the midsummer sun climbs almost straight overhead at noon, sitting close to 80 degrees above the horizon. The midwinter sun barely lifts to 30. A carpenter who knew those two numbers could size an eave that threw the entire south wall into shade through July, while still letting the low, slanting winter sun reach deep into the room come January. The same piece of timber blocks the season you're fighting and welcomes the season you're not. One fixed overhang, doing 2 opposite jobs, with no moving parts and not a watt of energy. We sell motorized blinds to chase that today and still get it wrong. Then there's what the roof was made of. The classic country farmhouse, the minka, wore a deep cap of thatch, sometimes 2 or 3 feet thick, pitched steep so the rain ran straight off. Thatch is mostly trapped air, which makes it a slow, stubborn barrier to the sun's heat, and its rough straw surface scatters sunlight instead of drinking it in. When researchers went and measured surviving thatched farmhouses up in northern Japan, they found the roof alone carried real weight, shading and insulating well enough to hold the indoor temperature down on a hot day. A roof that breathes and shades at the same time. Try pulling that out of a sheet of asphalt shingle baking black in the afternoon sun. There's a quiet genius hiding in that thatch too. Many of these farmhouses had a sunken hearth in the floor, the irori, and it burned more or less continuously. The household didn't vent that smoke straight outside. They let it drift up and seep through the underside of the thatch on its way out. That slow wash of wood smoke dried the roof from beneath, killed the insects that would have eaten it, and hardened the timber and the rope lashings black over the years. The same fire that cooked dinner was quietly preserving the house above it. You'd think a culture that clever would get copied everywhere. It mostly got forgotten. But here's where the design stops making sense to a modern builder. The cooling didn't stop at the roof. It ran straight down through the floor and out the bottom of the house. Walk up to a traditional Japanese house and you'll notice it doesn't sit on the ground. It stands lifted on wooden posts with a clear band of open air running underneath, often a couple of feet of it. That raised floor, the takayuka, turns the space beneath your feet into a wind tunnel. Air slides through that gap all day, carrying off the damp that would otherwise rise out of the soil and rot the timber from below. The crawl space even earned its own name, the en-no-shita, and on a scorching afternoon it was the coolest patch on the whole property, which is exactly why the household cat went there to sleep. A modern American house does the opposite on purpose. It pours a concrete slab flat onto the dirt, bolts the structure down to it, and then acts surprised when the floor sweats and the trapped heat has nowhere to go. So yeah, not a great trade. There was one place the Japanese house did reach for heavy mass, and the way they used it tells you everything. The entry in the kitchen often sat on a doma, a floor of packed bare earth, kept down at ground level. Earth a few feet down barely registers a heat wave passing overhead, so that floor stayed cool no matter how hard the sun beat on the roof. The same trick Europe leaned on to hoard a fire's warmth, the Japanese pointed in the exact opposite direction, using the cool of the ground to pull heat down and out of the living space. Even their thermal mass was working for summer. Now we reach the part that breaks a Western brain, the walls, because in a traditional Japanese house, there mostly weren't any. Here's the structural reason it was even possible. A Japanese house carried its weight on a frame of wooden posts and beams, not on its walls. The walls held up nothing. That meant the carpenter was free to make them out of almost anything or to leave them out entirely. So what you picture as walls were really sliding panels. Fusuma, the heavy opaque ones, and shoji, the light wooden lattices faced with translucent paper. Both ran in floor tracks and lifted clean out of them. When summer came, the household simply took the heavy panels down and stored them away, sliding in airy reed screens and slatted summer doors called natsudo in their place. In a single afternoon, a family could turn a snug winter cottage into something closer to an open pavilion, exposed on several sides, with a breeze running clean through the middle of the home. Try that with a sheet of drywall. The house wasn't a fixed box you endured. It was an instrument the family retuned with the calendar. Twice a year, as spring turned to summer, and again as autumn closed in, the whole household stopped and changed the house over, lifting out one set of panels and hanging the next, the way you'd swap a winter coat for a linen shirt. The building followed the seasons as closely as the clothes on your back. Even with the panels shut, the house kept breathing. Above the sliding doors, set into the wall, sat the ranma, carved and pierced wooden transoms. They looked like art, and they were, but their job was to let air and light pass from room to room, even when every door was closed. A house sealed for privacy still ventilated through its own walls. Running along the outer edge was the Ngawa, a wooden veranda tucked under those deep eaves, a shaded buffer zone between the hot garden and the cool interior, so the sun never struck the living space directly. And the materials underfoot kept working long after the doors were open. The floors were laid with tatami, thick mats of woven rush over pressed straw. Tatami quietly drinks moisture out of humid air and gives it back when the room dries, smoothing the swampy dampness that makes summer heat so much worse to sit in. The paper of the shoji pulled the same trick with light, softening a harsh sun into a cool, even glow across the room instead of a blazing hot rectangle on the floor. Every surface in the room was pulling in the same direction. Hardly anyone clocks that today, because we tore all of it out and replaced it with glass, gypsum board, and a dial on the wall. Before we get to the cleverest part of the whole system, one quick thing for anyone who finds this buried know-how addictive. Over at Medieval Way Store, I've pointed the same hands-on craft at the medieval kitchen. The medieval bakery collection, the recipe book, the sourdough manual, and the sourcing guide rebuilds the bread these households baked over that very hearth for a modern oven. The daily life behind the history is waiting there. Now step back from the single farmhouse for a moment, because the real masterpiece of this thinking shows up in the crowded city. In Kyoto, land along a street was taxed by how much frontage you took up, so merchants built narrow and built deep. The houses grew so long and skinny that people nicknamed them Unagi no Nedoko, the eel's bed. From the street you saw only a slim wooden front behind a lattice screen, the koshi, with small barred openings the merchants called insect cage windows, letting air and a sliver of light through while keeping eyes out. Inside, the house ran back 40, 50, sometimes 60 feet, far too deep for any window at the ends to ventilate. On paper, the middle of that house should have been a stale, suffocating box. It was the opposite, and the reason is beautiful engineering. Carved right into the body of the house were small interior gardens, the tsuboniwa, open straight up to the sky. Some were no bigger than a couple of square yards, named for the tsubo, an old unit of about 3.5 square meters. Tiny as they were, they ran the whole machine. Here's the physics. The deep eaves and the green planting keep that courtyard shaded and cool, while the front of the house, facing the sun-baked street, runs warm. Warm air is lighter, so it rises and slips out through skylights and the open court, and as it escapes, it drags cooler air in behind it off the shaded garden. The whole house becomes a slow, self-powered chimney. No wind required. The difference in temperature is the engine, running for free. The merchants gave that engine an even taller flue where they needed it most. Down one side of the eel's bed ran the toriniwa, an earthen-floored corridor that carried the kitchen the full depth of the house. Above the cooking range, the ceiling opened into a soaring void all the way up to a skylight in the roof, a built-in chimney called the hibukuro that sucked the heat and smoke of the fire straight up and out before it could spread. The hottest room in the house was rigged to empty itself into the sky, and they had a way to crank the whole thing by hand. On the worst afternoons, people would scatter water across the courtyard stones and the street out front, a practice called uchimizu. As that thin film of water evaporates, it cools the surface and the air just above it, and it nudges the local pressure down by a hair. That tiny dip is enough to coax a fresh draft in off the garden and pull it up through the house. A bucket of water, thrown on hot stone, summoning a breeze on a dead still day. That's the kind of move that ought to make your electric bill feel embarrassed. Every piece was in place, and what made the system work wasn't any single one of them. It was the way they all chained together. The eaves shaded the court. The shaded court fed the chimney. The chimney pulled air across the cool earthen floor and out through the open walls, and a splash of water on hot stone gave the whole loop a shove. Pull out any one link and the rest lose their grip. Keep them locked together and a house of wood and paper rides out 100-degree afternoon while the family inside barely breaks a sweat. So what do you do with all this, sitting in a sealed modern home with an air conditioner you're afraid to switch off? More than you'd guess, and none of it asks you to live in a museum. Start with the sun, because blocking heat beats chilling it every single time. Heat you stop at the window never becomes heat you have to fight indoors. Deep overhangs, exterior awnings, a reed screen or shade hung outside the glass on the south and west faces. All of it kills the worst of the summer load before it ever crosses the threshold. The key word is outside. Once sunlight is through the glass and into the room, the battle is mostly already lost, which is why an interior blind does so little. Next, give the air a road to travel. The eel's bed worked because air could run the full length of the house and leave somewhere up high. Look at your own place and trace the path a breeze would take. A low opening on the cool shaded side, a high opening on the far side for the hot air to escape through, and then stop strangling it with closed interior doors and furniture parked across the route. A house that can exhale from up high will cool itself for nothing on most summer evenings. A single high window or an open stairwell at the top of the house is often all it takes to turn the whole place into that slow chimney the merchants relied on. Borrow the floor and the chimney too. You can't lift a finished house onto posts, but you can quit sealing your home to the hot ground and start venting the spaces that hoard heat. The attic, above all, behaves exactly like the warm front of the eel's bed with no flue to escape through, so a vented well-shaded roof does real work. And lean on evaporation the way Uchimizu did. Hosing down a shaded patio or running water through a planted corner before evening drops the temperature of the air that drifts in after it. Last, think in seasons instead of one frozen number on a dial. The medieval house was rebuilt around the year, thrown open and shut down as the weather turned, with warmth aimed at the body and the one room in use, rather than poured into every empty corner of the building. You don't need paper walls to copy the logic. Shade and ventilate hard in summer, close up and capture the low sun in winter, and stop paying to hold one rigid temperature in rooms where nobody is standing. Which brings us back to that paper house in the Kyoto heat, the one you could see straight through. Next to your sealed glass tower, it looks fragile, almost primitive. It was nothing of the kind. It was the output of 5 centuries of carpenters testing themselves against the worst the summer could throw at them, keeping what held and burning the lessons of what failed into the next house, all of it aimed at one stubborn idea a monk wrote down in the 1330s. Build for the season that's trying to kill you, and work with the physics instead of against it. We buried that idea under cheap electricity and sealed glass. And now that the grid strains and the summers run hotter every year, the paper house is quietly winning the argument back. This is the kind of buried knowledge the climate control industry would just as soon you never went looking for. If you want more of it dug back up, the stuff that got paved over and forgotten, subscribe and stick around. There's a lot more still under the surface.